Good stuff. Good stuff. Hey everyone, it's Alex here. Today we're going to be talking about frame rates when filming. And I wanted to create a whole series centered around the basics of cameras and filmmaking. And I figured I'd lay some groundwork by talking about frame rates. Not the most exciting thing in the world, I know, but trust me when I say that when you understand this simple concept, it's going to make your video creation a whole lot easier. Now it helps to think of video as a string of images because that's basically what it is. Your camera is taking picture after picture after picture and stringing those together. Just like those old flip books you used to make when you were younger, a video camera does the same exact thing with a bunch of pictures. And then it just plays those pictures back super fast, and what you get out of it is a video. But the number of pictures contained within 1 second of real-time playback is your frame rate. That's how many frames or pictures are in that second. This is called your FPS, or your frames per second, or your frame rate, what we're talking about. So the frame rate is set when you begin filming on the camera. So right now I film this at 24 frames per second. If I wanted to change my frame rate, I would stop recording, change my camera settings to 30 or even 60, hit record again, and now it's capturing even more frames for that footage. And so when you're editing this footage, you select one frame rate that you want your final video product to be. And so that gives all of your footage a beat or a rhythm to match to. So obviously it's best if you're filming in 24 to have your final video be in 24 so that it matches up correctly. So for that reason, you can only have one playback frame rate in your video. You can shoot in multiple frame rates and incorporate that into your video, and that will give you different effects depending on your playback frame rate. But in the scope of what's actually possible, there's only one playback frame rate you can actually use per video. So this video is playing back at 24 frames per second. The most common frame rates that you're gonna see out there are 24, 30, 60, and 120. But let's dive into each of those in depth to really understand what that means. 24 frames per second means that within 1 second of playback time, your camera has captured 24 still images and strung them together. The video that you're watching right now is 24 frames per second. Typically it's used most in movies for the cinematic motion blur look that it creates. I can wave around and move around, and there's this blur, there's this kind of like a smooth feeling to it. And because it's not possible to change frame rates, I'm not gonna be able to switch to a different frame rate, say 60, and show you the effects that that would have within this video. Maybe I'll do separate videos on that in the future to just specifically talk about what each frame rate does. We'll see if I get enough interest, and let me know if you'd be interested in seeing that. Moving on to 30 frames per second, it means, you guessed it, there are 30 frames within 1 second of playback time. So your camera took 30 pictures instead of 24. Why such a marginal difference? TV shows actually use 30 frames per second more than 24. It creates just a slightly smoother, more fluid flowing look, and it's actually not even noticeable to the untrained eye. Even the trained eye, most of the time, you don't even notice the footage. It just depends on how you're working with it and how much flexibility you want to have when editing that footage. And the reason most TV shows still use 30 frames per second is way back in the olden days when TV first came around, that was actually the only frame rate that they could broadcast and air to the people across the network. So fast forward to modern technology today, they're still using 30 frames per second. I suppose sometimes the way we've always done it is good enough reason to not change it at all. All right, let's jump into 60 frames per second. This is where things start to change and get exciting a little bit, and you see the differences in using different frame rates. At 60 frames per second, you might feel a slight difference in playback speed. Things might feel a little more sped up. They're just not gonna feel quite as normal as a 24 or 30 frames per second video, which is what we're used to seeing all the time. And now this is also where we get the capabilities to use slow motion. So how this works is 60 frames per second, your camera captures 1 second of footage. There are 60 individual pictures within that footage. And let's say you open up a 24 frames per second timeline and you want your final video to be 24 FPS, just like this one is. In your regular footage, 1 second, 24 frames. That's kind of the timeline or the beat that your footage has to march to. If you have 60 frames per second, there's way more information packed within that 1 second than a 24 frames per second. There's about 3 times as much info. So what you can do is you take that 24 FPS footage, throw it into your timeline, your editing software to get it to match to 24. So now your original 60 frames per second clip gets about 3 times as long because you're playing it back at the speed of the video that you're watching. And those frames are coming by more slowly and there's more information to be processed through them. So what you get is the slow motion effect. It's taking longer for your clip to play out and your frames are slowly rolling through that 24 frame per second speed. that a good explanation? I hope that was a good explanation. Let me know if you have comments. And 60 frames per second is honestly the lowest frame rate I would shoot if you wanted to shoot slow motion. There's not much you could do with 30 or 24. Anything under that and your footage is just gonna look choppy and your video is just gonna look like jumpy and jittery. 60 frames per second is really the lowest you wanna go if you want some decent slow motion. And finally, we're gonna talk about 120 frames per second. This is a hugely high number, and most common affordable DSLRs can't even shoot this high, or they do it with some level of frame fudging that just kind of mixes them together and it doesn't really work out that great. Actually, your cell phone most likely can shoot at 120 frames per second. Did you know that? And this is a super noticeable difference from your 24 to 30 frames per second that you're used to. This footage, when played back normally, is gonna look super smooth. In fact, people might even ask you if it's sped up a little bit, because it's just gonna seem like you see every tiny little movement and there's no real motion blur in it. If you're really looking for some really great slow motion that's just drawn out and cinematic, 120 frames per second is definitely the way to go if you can. And you can actually go play around with this on your own. If you have an iPhone, you can change your frame rate and see how that affects your footage. If you go into your settings and scroll all the way down to your camera and go into record video, you'll see you have all of your different options. I like to record mine at 4K at 24 frames per second. That first number, so like the 720, the 1080, that's gonna be a resolution, and we'll talk about that in a later video. That's a separate concept. But what you're looking at is that 30 FPS, 30, 60, 24. So if you wanted to, if you were going to pull your footage out and use it in the editing software, 4K at 60 is gonna give you really good footage to work with. But I like to leave it at 4K 24, it just gives me a really nice, clean, cinematic looking image. So I'd encourage you to mess around with those settings and just see how your final video changes depending on what setting you're using. So that's it. Those are the most common frame rates that you see out there and a little bit of an explanation about how they work. It's actually a pretty simple concept once you wrap your mind around it and begin playing with it a little bit. It's one of those things that I for sure didn't understand at first until I actually picked up a camera and I changed the different settings, hit record, saw how it recorded, pulled it into my editing software, and then got to mess around with the speed and seeing how the different frames work in relation to the speed of your final video product. It's just really one of those things that you have to mess around with on your own, and then once you get it, you're like, oh, it makes total sense. It's actually a really simple concept. That's it for now. I hope you found this video educational, informative, maybe entertaining, and I hope you learned something new. See you in the next one.